what counts as true and what is good. And one has to tease out what Machiavelli could possibly mean by virtue, if it isn't exactly what we think of in terms of Aristotelian or Ciceronian cardinal virtues like justice, temperance, fortitude, and prudence. And in fact, prudence gets reworked as a virtue in Machiavelli. What does virtue mean? And what is it correlated to? Obviously, for the classical tradition, to be virtuous is to have some relationship to the good. It is what makes one happy, as Aristotle says, right? That activity of the soul in accordance with virtue is what gives us happiness. We hear these words, happiness, in Machiavelli. Virtue, good, true. And he says, you've read other thinkers, and we'll look at that important passage. You've heard other reasonings, musings about imagined cities, the best government. But what good is that to a prince, right? Who's faced with the actual question of how to hold on to power. And so you see Machiavelli making us think about, well, what is reality, right? The true is what describes is being in relation to what is real. There's no reason to think Machiavelli was. We can talk about it, but it's not clear that he's an atheist. Actually, that he may have a conventional religious sensibility, but it is, of course, extremely secular. He doesn't. The other world is not factoring into his account of how to live. And that in some sense, obviously, a lot of modern people will think that's modern. To how whatever you think about religion, transcendent reality, you bracket that, because we've got this world, we got brass tacks, we got facts on the ground, we got to deal with that. And that's what Machiavelli is saying. We have to deal with hard realities, and whatever works is something that we've got to take into account. And that's not, of course, silly. Our whatever notion of prudence we have, it can't be completely divorced from being in tune with circumstances, like how causality works in the world that we've got. And Machiavelli just pushes those things. Now, it's different. It's a very different worldview from what we see. So he's got a celebration in the passages we've got here. Agathocles, right? He's got a tyrant that we would hear in the Gorgias of Plato. This is a miserable life. But for Machiavelli, well, this prince has consolidated and held on to power. And now he says you can't. There he's very interesting, because he doesn't seem to want to go all the way and say, well, this man is virtuous, because even though we would think, given Machiavelli's other statements, isn't virtue simply being master of circumstance, to be the most skilled at handling all the variables? Agathocles is very skilled at handling the variables, but there is a limit, it seems, that Machiavelli is placing there. You wouldn't praise this man. And yet, there he is as a figure that isn't that much different from Cesare Borgia or Julius II. So we need to talk about it, right? Is there an actual is there something Machiavelli still holds on to as the limit of morality? But he does raise this question, because do we think that state actors are bound by morality? Do we think governments have the right to engage in propagandistic lies, stratagems that are deceitful with regard to other states, and so on? Human intelligence that requires subterfuge, duplicitous alliances, making agreements and saying that we will have your back when we don't actually mean it, things like that. Do we think this is a bad way to run a government? Now, all of that's in the context of Machiavelli's support, really his deep commitment to Republican government. So in this little work, which is, of course, more read than the Discourses on Livy, in which he lays out his Republican sentiments, the Prince is written here's a man who acknowledges the force of circumstance. He's been thrown out of government by the restoration of the Medici by the forces of Julius II. He's even been tortured by the Medici, and yet he's not a person who gets hung up on this thing that would get in the way of his trying to get back into the game that's actually being played. And so he writes this work to the head of the Medici family in Florence. At first, that would have been Giuliano, but at this point, it's Lorenzo, the grandson of Il Magnifico, Lorenzo the Magnificent, the real magnificent one. This Lorenzo wasn't. He's not going to stand on principle, obviously. He's not going to say, well, these guys mistreated me. They showed me dishonor. I'm not going to play. I'm going to do what Dante did, right, is try to get into some kind of conspiracy to overthrow these people. He knew that's silly, that the Medici would hold, they have power in the College of Cardinals, they have power here, and they're eventually going to have both the papacy and Florence, two of the five major powers of the Italian peninsula. And so he'll tack to that wind. He'll say, my goal is in the end to see a unified Italy that is free of these barbarian, these outside forces. And I'll work with the Medici to do that because they've got the power to do it. This is realistic. He lived he lived by what he preached. So he writes this little book. Even though he's a Republican, he's writing to the prince that has overthrown his republic that he served, right? He was very much a central figure in the restored Florentine Republic, the head of the Second Chancery, organized the militia that Florence had, such as it had, and he was a practitioner. This is not an airy theorist. He's basing himself off of very extensive political and diplomatic interaction. So it's something we have to take very seriously. He's not just an academic, right? And the story has to be put in this context of papal corruption. I say that partly as a Catholic theologian, but also because this is an essential part of the story of the shift from medieval to modern. Lorenzo the Magnificent's son, Giovanni, would eventually become Leo X, who is the infamous pope who would authorize the selling of indulgences in the German territories. So he rules from 1513 to 1521. This is what instigates the Lutheran revolt. And it's just, for any Catholic, certainly, it's not a very pleasant spectacle, and one just has to own it and say this was horrendous behavior. Leo X, as the Medici Pope, had just, on top of previous actors such as Julius II, who led armies to reconquer the Papal States, and just very scandalous things. And then the adopted son of Lorenzo, Giulio, would eventually become Pope Clement VII, who reigned from 1523 to 34. And that includes the horrendous sack of Rome in 1527 not by Emperor Charles V, but this is one of the great ironies. The great Catholic emperor who was the armed force of the Counter-Reformation, as it were, but he had Protestant soldiers in his employ, and they're the ones who sacked the city so brutally. So my point being, here with Machiavelli, we have a man who really cares about the legacy of Rome. I mean, he cares about it in terms especially of the Roman Republic and what that could mean for organizing a state in modern times. What can we take, not copying slavishly, because that's not what Machiavelli does. He's able to abstract. He's a great student of history, and he's abstracting principles that he would want applied creatively to a new set of circumstances. But the great model is the Roman Republic for him, and he wants to apply that to these times. Well, he wants to celebrate Romanitas, right? This Roman legacy. But the great representative of Rome at this time, the Pope, the papacy has been going back at least to the Avignon captivity. So we're talking about for 2 centuries of scandalous behavior. So that for me, I think that's what really breaks the mind of Europe finally. But because Rome it's lost any sense at all, right? The political power had already gone east to Constantinople. That falls in 1453. so a few decades before this. Rome as an empire is gone. The Holy Roman Emperor is still there, but has been fighting Rome. The two have been engaged in this blood feud for centuries. So what gives a focal point to Europe? And that's one of the things or the West, quote unquote. Do we think in a world of nation states, which is what's rising here, right? France is a very strong early nation state. England, of course, those two, that 100 Years' War forming, really new, crystallizing those new nation states. You get Spain coming up, you get the German states, and that's the one that's going to take the longest, along with Italy, to coalesce. But we have nation states. So is there a way to recover a sense of Romanitas where you have a cultural civilization that takes from the Greeks and from any culture, really, the Christian, the Athens and Jerusalem, and is willing to build a new thing in new times? Well, Machiavelli is giving us a way to try to navigate new waters, and we have to just take him seriously. It's no good, I think, to moralize on Machiavelli. I think we have to take him as a very serious thinker, especially since we are committed, I think, to a Republican form of government. I guess not everybody is, but and I'll end with just a few thoughts about what republicanism means. Machiavelli, of course, starts the prince by saying there are either principalities, that is monarchies, rule of one, and those that are not. And that would, so really you've got a republic being that where you don't have autocratic rule, but also you can draw from the plebeian distinction where it's the republic is really a system of government where there are checks and balances, where you've got the one, the few, and the many represented by different organs of government. So that's obviously exemplified in the American system, and that's indeed a lot of the founders took Machiavelli seriously as a Republican theorist.